All right, so next week we're going to do music. So we're going to follow up on the reading this week with some reading from Adorno. We'll see the curves of the needle, form of the phonograph record. Benjamin, we'll see in the work of art essay later. Sound recording photography as related phenomena, what it does to our experience of listening to music, for example. But the long reading for next time is the fetish character in music and the regression of listening. On the social situation of music is also kind of long, but we'll probably spend a little bit more attention on the fetish character essay. The other ones are very short pieces. And I think that I have, if I'm not mistaken, there is some music selections for us to let's see. I have some MP3s. Yeah, so I'll refresh this so that you guys have access to the. Make sure these things are here. Yes, they are here. So we've got some MP3s to listen to help illustrate through music what Adorno is writing about. Any volunteers for next time? Anyone with a music background? Okay, that's one. Who are my volunteers for this week? One and okay, you guys. Okay, great. All right. So we're very minimal numbers today. I don't know who might arrive a little bit late. We'll see if I can get another volunteer for next week, maybe in the breaking class. All right. So we're shifting gears now from the kind of theory of Marxism and capitalism and crisis of society and capitalism now to cultural criticism or cultural critique. So this week and next week we're reading three writers who are personally acquainted with each other, quite influential on each other, they're kind of colleagues, collaborators. So Siegfried Kracauer, who we read this time, he's a friend of Benjamin. He's also Adorno, who we'll be reading next week. He's Adorno's a philosophy tutor in high school. So Benjamin and Kracauer are a little bit older. Adorno's a little bit younger. So Kracauer is a friend of the family and reads philosophy with the teenage Adorno. And then Benjamin describes Adorno as his only student later on. So we will see in the readings for today, I think I mentioned this last week, that Kracauer makes an aside in his photography essay saying someone ought to do a history of early photography and its relationship to photography now, and Benjamin takes that up, and that's why we have a little history of photography we read for today. So cultural criticism. Did we do the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena? Did we do that discussion? We did. Okay, so we're pursuing that now into cultural forms and aesthetic forms in particular. So let's start with the mass ornament, which will help us kind of set the agenda for what this kind of cultural criticism looks like. So Kracauer's pieces are from basically the Sunday culture section. Today it would be the Sunday magazine of the main weekly newspaper in Frankfurt. Right, so you're kind of sitting down to have breakfast Sunday morning, relaxing weekend, and bam. The position that an epoch occupies in the historical process can be determined more strikingly from an analysis of its inconspicuous surface-level expressions than from that epoch's judgments about itself. Since these judgments are expressions of the tendencies of a particular era, they do not offer conclusive testimony about its overall constitution. The surface-level expressions, however, by virtue of their unconscious nature, provide unmediated access to the fundamental substance of the state of things. Conversely, knowledge of the state of things depends on the interpretation of these surface-level expressions. The fundamental substance of an epoch and its unheeded impulses illuminate each other reciprocally. Okay, so it's more ordinary for readers in German to encounter this extremely abstract philosophical language. It's not for us. So when we did the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, if we did, I hope that we did, yes. We did the being and becoming dialectic of transformation, but the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, I pointed out that there's a catchphrase from Hegel that's guiding here, which is the essence must appear. And essence and substance are equivalent terms in this philosophical language. So the essence must appear. So it's very different from the ancient idea that essence and appearance are in conflict. So the ancient idea is that the ancient philosophical idea, going back to the pre-Socratics and Plato, Aristotle, is that essences are true and eternal, they're unchanging, whereas appearances are changing and deceptive. Right? So appearances are illusory and deceptive, and they change, and so we can't actually know the essential truth through the phenomenal world. So the division between the noumenon and the phenomenon. With Kant and Hegel, it's the opposite, which is that we actually do know the essence or substance of things through the appearance of things. In fact, that's the only way that we can know it. So it's about the truth of appearances rather than the falsity of appearances, the truth of appearances. Now, one of the reasons why that flip is made by Kant and Hegel is because this is a radical revolution in philosophy, is because what's discovered in the 17th and 18th centuries, in the 1600s and 1700s, is that the substance, the essence, changes. It's not eternal, but the substance or essence changes. So we can track the changes of substance through the changes of appearance. And one of the things that we talked about last week with Wilhelm Reich was the lag in consciousness. So the idea that social being changes before consciousness changes, or the socioeconomic base changes before the ideological superstructure changes. So there's a lag in consciousness, there's a kind of lag in ideology behind the curve of changes in the practical reality in capitalism. So the industrial forces of production outstrip the bourgeois social relations of production. Now, that would seem to make sense straightforwardly, meaning often we do things practically before we have an adequate theory for explaining it. However, in the case of capitalism, it has a little bit more of a bite to it. And there's more of a critical character in this temporal or historical contradiction. That in fact capitalism is defined by Marxists as this historical contradiction. So I think that I explained it by virtue of the United States. We live in the First Republic here after the Revolution, and so our ostensible values of the at least political order, but also the social order, are those of the Enlightenment of the 1700s, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all with equal inalienable rights. However, the 1800s, the 19th century reality of capitalism has tended to violate those principles, violate those rights. And so we live in this actual contradiction between our ostensible values and our practical life circumstances. And indeed, that's Marx's point with the proletariat, because the proletariat really shouldn't exist. like in our own conception of the way society is supposed to be, there should be no such thing as a proletariat at all. Right? We should all be equal bourgeois subjects, all like participants, contributors, productive members of society. There should be no proletariat. So the existence of the proletariat is a contradiction. Okay, so Kracauer himself is not a Marxist. However, he's Marxisant, meaning he's familiar with Marxism at a theoretical level. He's not a Marxist because he doesn't believe in the political practice of Marxism. He doesn't believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat and all that good stuff. So he has intellectual respect for Marx and for Marxism in certain respects, but not for the politics of Marxism. He's more of a liberal democratic type person. He is, however, influenced by, like Benjamin and Adorno, by Lukács's work, whose work we read last time, The Phenomenon of Reification. So in some ways, we can understand the readings that we're doing this week and next week as the attempt to bring the critique of reification into cultural criticism. Okay, so what does it mean to say that the judgments of an epoch about itself are misleading? So part of what he's addressing here is the inability of cultural criticism to deal with new phenomena. So his example in this essay, in Mass Ornament, is the Tiller Girls, calls the products of American distraction factories. So this is an American dance troupe that tours the world. They tour the world. They perform in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe. They tour the world. The Tiller Girls. And basically in Germany, and maybe elsewhere as well, but specifically in Germany, and specifically in the kind of liberal Germany. So Frankfurt, what is Frankfurt in Germany? Frankfurt has an interesting history, so it's the financial capital of Germany. And it's close to the political capital of Germany, which is Berlin. And also Berlin has the importance of industrial capital character to it. But Frankfurt is the financial capital, and also it's the old sort of liberal city. So it's Western Germany. It's in the Rhineland. It is the place where, during the revolutions of 1848, the Frankfurt Assembly convened there, and that was an attempt to establish a German democratic republic. So in the revolution of 1848, Frankfurt was the center of the revolution in Germany. Nonetheless, this is post-World War I. Germany was defeated. The Prussian Empire. Kaiser Wilhelm stepped down. There was a little revolution in 1918-1919. Rosa Luxemburg was killed. The revolution was put down. The Social Democrats were the government for a time, but eventually it settled into a more typical conservative and liberal governing phenomena of politics. In the Weimar Republic, he's writing these essays 1927, 1928. So it's on the brink of, but not quite yet, at the Great Depression, the financial crash that we talked about last time with Wilhelm Reich. So it's still the kind of roaring 20s, it's still that period. And the Tiller Girls and other such products are condemned by everyone left, right, and center. And so the center, kind of liberals, they think, oh, this is sort of trash commercial entertainment for the masses. The right condemns it as, again, in very similar terms, the extreme right, the Nazis, because the Nazis are definitely there in 1927, 1928. They're definitely a force that's built up. They condemn it as Jewish entertainment, right? Hollywood, that's what that means. Distraction, American distraction factories. The Tiller is Jewish. So they condemn it that way. The conservatives are like, we don't need this American culture. What about good German culture? The left also condemns it, though. The Social Democrats and the Communists also condemn it as what? As capitalist culture. Capitalist culture, exploitation of women, objectification of women. Yeah, that's how they see it. This is objectification of women, exploitation of women, capitalist entertainment to distract the masses from the task of revolution. And Kracauer wants to say none of this will do. Like the universal kind of blindness to the truth of the mass ornament just won't do. Left, right, and center, they all are bringing essentially a backward or conservative criticism in the face of the new phenomenon. So he's trying to address it in this other way. Now, he invokes some thought figures that are unfamiliar to us, but would have been more familiar to a German audience, German readership. So when he brings up fairy tales, and he makes the distinction between fairy tale and myth. So fairy tales, the Brothers Grimm, right? So there is this, in the bourgeois era, in the more modern era, there is this compilation and also revision of the old myths and legends. And one of the things that distinguishes fairy tales from myth is that myth, like tragedy, like ancient tragedy, myth is about the power of the gods, the power of fate, the power of nature. So it's about a kind of tragic end that shows the power of destiny, of fate, of nature. Fairy tales, by contrast, end with Hansel and Gretel defeating the witch and living happily ever after. Right? So fairy tales are about defying fate, figuring out, overcoming the forces of nature, and living happily ever after. So this distinction between the myth and the fairy tale is really on point because it's about capitalism. So he accepts that the mass ornament is clearly capitalist culture. However, since capitalism is ambivalent, this is the language he uses, it's fundamentally ambivalent about the mass ornament, so is its cultural products. So it is still bourgeois culture, and bourgeois culture is about enlightenment. It's not about myth-making and accepting fate, destiny, nature, the will of the gods, the will of God. It's about figuring things out, use of reason, freedom. It's about freedom. And that's what living happily ever after means. It means freedom. And we live in a bourgeois society, including in Germany, even though it was the Prussian Empire, it had nonetheless been bourgeoisified. And so when people go to culture, they go to it for bourgeois reasons. They go to art for enlightenment. Like, this is the idea. It's the sort of Kant idea, Hegel idea. It's the general idea that art serves a enlightening and liberating function. Art enlightens us about ourselves and about the world and shows us the possibility of freedom in its experiential character, in its experiential content. And also all art, it not only does that, which is sort of a grand sort of geistig or spiritual mission, but also art in a more direct way, how it does that, how it enlightens us about things, about ourselves, and about the possibility of freedom, is that it instructs us. Every work of art is like a little art education exercise. So art educates us about itself. It enlightens us about itself. So art is instructive about itself. And that in being instructive and educating about itself, it actually tells us about ourselves, the world, and the possibility of changing it, freedom. So the masses don't just go to be stupefied and, rendered dull and distracted. No, they're going for enlightenment and they're finding it. So the issue is, what's the appeal? What's the popular appeal of something like the Tiller Girls? It has a popular appeal, so it's condemned by left, right, and center. Nonetheless, the masses flock to it. So they must be getting something out of it. What are they getting out of it? They are getting some kind of an enlightenment about their situation, about capitalism. However, because it's capitalism and because capitalism is ambivalent, it's doing something else. It's enlightening, but it's also mythologizing. So because capitalism is ambivalent, we encountered this last week in terms of Rosa Luxemburg's socialism or barbarism. And so capitalism is ambivalent. It can lead to barbarism. It can lead to socialism. In other words, it can lead to enlightenment and freedom. Or, as he'll talk about in the photography essay, it can sink us in nature. So capitalism can sink us in nature. And by nature is meant not just physical and biological nature, but historical nature. In other words, it can land us in a kind of historical dead end that we feel is our fate. And so capitalism can appear as a fate, as a tragic end, or it can appear as a task of freedom, task of overcoming. So capitalism can be a tragic fate, a myth. It can mythologize itself, or it can direct us, it can point us in the direction of living happily ever after, even if we have to go through fearsome suffering and like real tragic calamities along the way. So capitalism has clearly caused a tremendous amount of suffering. The question is, what's the meaning of that suffering? If the meaning of the suffering is that we struggle through it and come out on the other end with an accomplishment of freedom, that's one story. The other story is that it's just this permanent hell that we land in. It's the ultimate triumph of history, fate, nature. Some evil god condemned us to this hell. Right? So, because capitalism itself has that ambivalence, all its phenomena have this ambivalence, including something seemingly as inconspicuous or kind of negligible as this kind of popular entertainment, the Tiller Girls. All right, so that's myth, fairy tale. The other is a kind of sociological distinction, but also a broader distinction: Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft, or community and society. That's related to another German, 19th century Romantic distinction between culture and civilization. So Germany was generally backward until the post-Franco-Prussian War era. It was a backwater of Europe. It had some role in modern manufacturing and industry. It was actually a kind of a cheap labor site. So when there was labor struggles in England in the early 1800s, people who were against the working class organizing and striking and unionizing, they said, well, if you succeed in defeating your employers and making labor too expensive, all that will happen is they'll move their operation to Germany, where they can pay people a lot less. So in some ways, Germany in the mid-1800s was like China was 20 years ago, or even up till rather recently. I think that I mentioned to you guys that Russia, around the turn of the century, Russia was more like China had been in the post-2000 era. It was a major, significant, giant factory for the world before World War I. So it was the cheap manufacturing zone up to that time. Okay, so Germany was relatively backward, but it caught up pretty quickly in the Second Industrial Revolution, and it also was in the forefront in many respects. Nonetheless, it still had this kind of chip on its shoulder about being second banana to England and France and the United States. So the idea that they had was civilization and culture. They said, well, France, Paris is the new Rome, maybe, or London is the new Rome, or New York is the new Rome. They have civilization, but we Germans have culture. So they have civilization, we have culture. And they had this conceit of themselves, they're the inheritors of the Greeks. So Germans have art and philosophy, whereas the French and the Americans and the British, they have politics, they have commerce, they have these empires that the Germans don't have. And basically this distinction is a kind of romantic distinction, which is that you could have a formal civilization that's kind of superficial, or you could have a substantial culture. So they thought that their culture was substantial. In the post-World War I era then, in the Weimar Republic, the idea of like cultural imperialism or being colonized by American culture, what that means is that the good old Gemeinschaft community of German culture was being replaced by the superficial commercial Gesellschaft of civilization imposed by the West, the victors of World War I, the Americans, the British, and the French. Right, so a lot of this feeds into Nazism, of course, but it's more widespread than just the Nazis. And it has its roots in the 1800s, this distinction. So Gesellschaft, society, Gemeinschaft, community. Right, so community sounds like more substantial, Gesellschaft more formal, more superficial, more artificial. And of course Kracauer doesn't buy into that. Nonetheless, he has to address it. He has to address how the Tiller girls, how the mass ornament appears to be the superficial bread and circuses, we might say, of civilization as opposed to the substantial poetry of the community, which is the way the Germans like to understand it. Yeah.
But the whole idea of using the word ambivalence.
Yeah.
Can you, I guess, explain that a little bit more? That was something
Through you?
that was hard for me to follow.
So we, in English, in a popular colloquial sense, we say ambivalence, we mean lukewarm or wishy-washy or kind of neutral. Ambivalence here means literally like two different values coexisting. So like two opposed values coexisting. Right, so it's more like, I think on the first day of class we read the Hamza Walker piece, the alumni magazine profile, and he said some Freudian dynamic must be at work because he's ambivalent about contemporary art, and I said that's love and hate. Right, so that's what ambivalence means. It means two-faced, we could see dialectically opposite, contradictory, rather than neutral, lukewarm, wishy-washy.
With capitalism, it's both like being viewed as something that's be positive or negative at the same time, depending on.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And again, this romantic view would associate like technical reason and rationality with civilization and with society, and would instead counterposed to that would be like feeling and intuition, which would be more culture and community. Right, so, and also there would be this idea that, again, civilization, society would be more abstract, whereas community and culture would be more concrete. Right, so basically, the Tiller girls seem to be about abstraction, so this is one of his categories of contradiction. So in terms of the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, we have some categories of contradiction. We have abstraction versus abstractness. Right, so he associates reason with abstraction, but then it's a murky reason in capitalism that yields just abstractness. Right, so it's kind of a halfway reasoned through, and it gives us this strange kind of abstractness, so kind of incomplete reason. I think he says, the problem is not that capitalism reasons too much, but that it reasons too little. Right, so again, the kind of German romantic response to capitalism is that it's kind of cold, calculating, rational, and violates the sensibility of the people, of the folk. Right. So Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. Right. So that's, another couple of categories. So I did myth and fairy tale, reason and ratio. So ratio, ARTIO. So that's not the mathematical term, ratio. It's ratio, so it's the Latin word for reason. So why does he use that? Because it's kind of reified reason. So it's reason as an end in itself or taking on a life of its own rather than as an instrument that we use for our purposes. So reason is something that we exercise, but ratio seems like it's an alienated reason that takes on a life of its own. So the capitalist ratio as opposed to human reason. So these are the ambivalent values that the Mass ornament exhibits. So the Mass ornament exhibits this contradiction between reason and ratio, between abstraction and abstractness, and between myth and fairy tale. Another term that's unfamiliar, body culture. Body culture. So it's a kind of a general term. He says body culture, but it also means something more specific. So body culture would be, and again, the left, right, and center thing, like healthy mind, healthy body, right? So like exercise, like keeping fit. So the Nazis and the Social Democrats and the communists, they all had like a culture of staying fit and exercise, and they had sports clubs, and they would have the workers do calisthenics in the morning, this idea. And versus the Mass ornament, versus the more abstract geometrical formations of what he calls not bodies, but parts of bodies that take on new constellations. Right, but he says they're really two sides of the same thing. So the thing with body culture, the cult of the beautiful body, which is very German, very romantic kind of idea, and it's based on this kind of Greek ideal of like the gymnasium, like physical education, mental education, aesthetic education, spiritual education. It is based on an analytic and reconstructive attitude towards the body, but it hides behind a kind of natural ideal of the body. Right? So it sort of pretends that this kind of artificial image of the body and what health and fitness and exercise is about, they hide that behind the idea that what you're doing when you work out, when you exercise, is that you're kind of restoring your natural body. Whereas in fact, what you're doing is you're altering your body. Right? So, whereas by contrast, the Tiller Girls performance doesn't hide behind that natural kind of avoidance of the analytic and the artificial, but sort of is directly artificial and analytical and abstracting. And so it's literally the deconstruction and reconstruction of the body that the body culture kind of masks behind this cult of natural beauty, the natural condition of the body. All right, so in body culture, we have this ambivalence as well, which is what's the point of body culture? Is it to maintain or restore nature, or is it in fact to alter and reconstruct nature, according to reason? So what he appreciates about the Tiller Girls, what he appreciates about the Mass ornament in general, is that it makes this plain. It sort of lays it out. It demonstrates it. And yet that's also what freaks people out, like the cultural critics. It freaks them out. But the masses clearly get it, he thinks, because they're going to see it and they're enjoying it. Right? So they understand in a way that the critics don't. And they might only understand it unconsciously, nonetheless they get it. Right? They don't have kind of a priori judgments getting in the way of appreciating the truth of this form. Right? Because that's really the issue. The issue is what's the truth of this new phenomenon. Right? And obviously the truth of it is capitalism, and therefore it's the truth of quote-unquote ambivalence or contradiction. Nonetheless, it is to be seen. Now, okay, so on the one hand, the masses go to see this and enjoy it, and on an unconscious level, they know what it's about. There is a point to the cultural criticism, however. In other words, Kracauer's essay is not redundant. So if you recall from the first week of class, Susan Buck-Morse, that she said that the task of criticism is to make conscious what was previously only dimly perceived. Right, so he's trying to articulate and make explicit what people already know. Again, the Kantian idea, which is that the task of philosophy or the task of theory in this instance, or the task of criticism, is to sort of articulate explicitly and try to kind of analytically break down and explain what everyone already knows in common sense. If you recall also the Heine, we read Heinrich Heine, and he was complaining about the critics and how the critics come with their a priori principles, and that blinds them to the actual works, prevents them from seeing what's really happening in the works. Right, so there's a kind of a long tradition of this idea going back to Kant and Hegel and Heine, and now brought up into the 20th century about the task of this kind of writing. Like, what's the point of it? What is it actually accomplishing? What is it doing? It's making people more explicitly aware of something that they already know. So this is going to be true for Benjamin and Adorno as well, right? That they're trying to make explicit what people already know. The difficulty is that what people already know is actually contradictory. In other words, they know a contradictory truth, and so that adds another wrinkle to it, which is that common sense or the common sensibility of the people is actually contradictory in character, and so there might be a reason for people to avoid the truth because it is contradictory. So an added task in comparison to Kant and Hegel would be that this kind of criticism is to make explicit the contradiction and to get people to face it, rather than just enjoying it and sort of experiencing it, but sort of suppressing the contradiction of it. So I mentioned he's not a Marxist in the sense that he doesn't agree with the Marxist program. Nonetheless, he is, like many people of his time, a kind of liberal, socialistically minded person who thinks that capitalism is bad and can and should be overcome. Like people today. Like if you were to go near where I live, I'm in Uptown, in Buena Park, the rich white people, and Southport, up in West Lakeview, and you just randomly interview people on the street about capitalism, everyone would say, oh yes, we should do away with capitalism, we should overcome capitalism. So, he can count on his audience, the Frankfurt liberal newspaper readership, to basically have this idea of capitalism, yeah, it's our reality, but, something better would be preferable to this. Right? We don't want to be too extreme. We don't want to go with the Marxists. That's a little bit too much, right? And we don't want to, turn back the clock on capitalism like the Nazis want to do, right? But yeah, we should probably overcome this problem. All right, so let me see what you guys raised about this essay in particular. Yeah, if you want to.
A lot of it you kind of already touched on, but mostly what I noticed was how he was talking about taking away the individuality of the individual, and where they, the mass ornament, they become kind of a spectacle or something like that. But it also relates to the workers in the factories and how they're kind of reduced down to their hands and the tasks that they do. And also the imposition of rationality onto that. Which, from some further reading that I was looking into to help supplement was, I don't remember, I think it's Taylorism.
Taylorism, yeah.
Right? So that's kind of the
That's right. So Taylorism is a contemporary phenomenon. Have you guys seen the Muybridge photographs about human motion? Right. So Taylor did human motion studies, especially around work tasks, and it's ambivalent. Taylorism is ambivalent. So we associate it, good progressive people after the 20th century, we associate Taylorism with like, oh, the capitalists just like tried to streamline and rationalize the workers' action in order to more maximally exploit them. In fact, the goal of Taylorism was to reduce workplace injury on the assembly line. And it did. It actually did. It improved that situation for the workers a great deal. It made work far safer. It did also make it more efficient and therefore, more well exploited, for sure. But so the issue is something that we talked about last time with Lukács and reification, means and ends. Means and ends. So with Lukács, the idea was that in capitalism, all the particular activities are rational as to their means. So all the different specialized activities in society, all the domains of activity are rational. However, they kind of don't add up to a rational whole in society. And that way of, the way that Lukács approached it and the way that Kracauer is following Lukács is the means are rational, but the ends are irrational. So capitalism is an end in itself. What that means, it's in the word itself, capitalism, that we might think of capitalism as a means to our end, like an economic system that provides the goods and allows for the maximum amount of freedom and rights and etc. But in fact, what it is a system that serves capital. So and that doesn't just mean the capitalist class. So it means what Marx brought in, alienated labor. So capital is alienated labor. So means and ends have entered into a strange relationship where the means become an end in themselves. Right, so capitalism is about perfecting the means, but as an end in itself. Now that doesn't sound too bad. Well, no, it's not merely that, but it's also towards the ends of capital. So it's alienated labor. And he thinks that popular entertainment like the Tiller Girls that has like no content, it has no like inherent content, it's just the spectacle, it's just the geometrical forms, seems to be an end in itself. And that's what's so illuminating about the Tiller Girls in particular, is that it's almost like an experiment in how you could do this mass abstract choreography for its own sake. Right, so this is what, we'll come back around to this with Benjamin's work of art essay, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which is l'art polar, art for art's sake. Right, so this is a variety of l'art polar, but in a very pointed way, namely that it exhibits this extreme kind of analytical abstraction and rationalization as to the parts. And he says it's empty at its center. So the mass ornament is empty at its center. It's a star constructed around this empty center that includes the performers and the audience. Now, why is it empty at the center? Because, of course, it's a means that's become an end in itself, and in the way he's addressing it, its true end has not been reached. So the way he describes it is there's no way around the mass ornament, but only through the mass ornament. And why? Because there's no way around capitalism, there's only through capitalism. There's only in and through capitalism. So the question is whether we get stuck in capitalism or whether we come out on the other end, whether we stay in this place where it's empty at its center, or whether we pass through that empty center to something else. So whether capitalism remains a means that becomes an end in itself, or whether it becomes a means to a further end. So a means to a further end would be socialism. Meaning, what's the meaning of this hyper-exploitation of human labor in the industrial era? Well, as an end in itself, it's a hell. As a means to an end and bringing about socialism, then it's something else entirely. Right, so that's the basic kind of parable, you might say, that's operant here. But again, the actual texture of it, the actual aesthetic experience of it is important. In other words, it's not an abstract proposition, it's an actual aesthetic ornament. Right, so we think of an ornament as inessential. We think of it as just a sort of decoration. And it's easy to ignore something like the mass ornament, like the Tiller girls. To just say, oh, yeah, it's like a sideshow or something. And he's saying, well, no, it gives us the truth of the whole thing, the whole situation of society at this moment in history. Right, so again, labor has always been exploited. There was slavery, there was serfdom, there was all kinds of things. Labor has always been exploited. The exploiters always tried to maximize the exploitation of the exploited. What's new and different about capitalism is that it points beyond itself. So labor has always been exploited. However, the mass ornament didn't always exist. The mass ornament, as he's describing it, something like the Tiller girls actually wouldn't make sense in any other situation but the early 20th century. He brings up the possibility, is it our tribal dance? Is it the equivalent of the ancient tribal dance? In other words, is it just the sort of aesthetic reflex of the community? Is it just the performance of the community in a kind of allegorical form? And he says yes and no. Yes, but this is a different kind of community than the old community. This is a different community than the traditional community of pre-capitalist life. It has a ritual character to it, but it isn't simply an affirmation of the community, it's also an instantiation of this crisis and need to get beyond this form of society. Right? So whereas the old tribal dance kind of ritual, kind of aesthetic enactment of the community was full of content, what's significant, the content of the mass ornament is its emptiness. Right, but it means something. In other words, the cultural critics, besides him, are just like, what is this empty entertainment? What is this mindless distraction? And he's like, no, that's the point. That's actually the point. Its emptiness is its content. And of course, that, like I said, is a parable for capitalism itself. In other words, capitalism seems like a morally value-free society. So it seems like a kind of an amoral, if not simply immoral society. And yet, no, it's moral freedom, but also it really is amoral in a way that's kind of nihilistic. And yet, even that has a significance. Its significance is not merely its neutrality, but the fact that it points beyond itself. Let's look at...
And then my hands were in the reply.
Oh, you got it there? Okay, so let's see. Let me try to refresh it and see it, unless you put it in a different week. You might put it in a different
I think
week.
you just put it, go down, like that arrow.
Oh, one reply. Why does it not just show it? That's terrible. Okay. Yeah, Radu.
Yeah, basically a lot of what we discussed, but I think with this like lack or the emptiness is the content, I was really intrigued by the use of transparency and the idea of unity when he was describing it, of like the audience and the performer, and it's exactly that of like the audience member realizing the same emptiness that the performer is having.
Let me say something about this. So, okay. So what makes it possible for us to enjoy this? it's also the same thing that makes it possible for the choreographer to have conceived it and also for the performers to enact it. Right? So the same attitude towards the body is universal among the producers and the consumers of the mass ornament. And that attitude towards the body that's exhibited in the mass ornament is new and different. Right, so that's the idea. The idea is that this is actually a new kind of experience of ourselves, experience of like our physical bodies, experience of our kind of natural condition, and that all of that has to be in common for this phenomenon to even arise at all, for it to happen at all. So it has to make sense. Someone, the choreographer had to make sense to conceive of such a thing. The performers also have to be amenable to be able to have this attitude towards their own bodies so that they can do this kind of performance. And of course, the masses, it's popular because it makes sense to them too. Right, so there is a common sense exhibited here, but it's a very peculiar kind of common sense. Again, it's a kind of contradictory common sense. Maybe another way of putting how the left would condemn the Tiller Girls is that they would say that this is the degree to which the masses are enjoying it, they're simply reveling in their own dehumanization in capitalism. And Kracauer is like, well, of course you could call it that, but that would be kind of one-sided, and that would suggest that we should go back to an older form of humanity and community, and we're not going back. We're going forward through this thing, capitalism. We're not ever going back. That's the sad truth. We're only going forward through capitalism. And so to even say that it's dehumanizing, it's a little bit beside the point. Yeah, it is, but that doesn't mean that we can restore the old version of the human. Which, after all, was itself artificial. It only appears natural in retrospect. Right? Humans have been altering their nature, have been producing an artificial culture for tens of thousands of years. And yet capitalism appears very much unnatural, dehumanizing, in a very pointed way. So again, is capitalism a wrong turn that we've taken and a dead end that we've ended up in? Or is it a tragic fate? Or is it a happily ever after story? We better hope it's a happily ever after story. So about transparency, let's talk about this, because this is actually very important both for Benjamin and for Adorno and also for Kracauer. It's something that, in fact, Lukács introduced last time, which is the opaque versus the transparent, right? So the idea that in this society, things are opaque, the society is opaque to us on the one hand, but also it's transparent, meaning when looking at the Tiller Girls, you have this double experience. That on the one hand, it is illuminating, it is enlightening, it is like a transparent presentation of capitalism, but it's also a transparent presentation of the opacity of capitalism. And so it also demonstrates, it makes visible how the society is opaque to us. And in that respect, it's mythologizing, it's mystifying. Right, but even the mythologizing and the mystification, the opacity, is illuminating, is enlightening. Right, so that's another kind of contradiction, the opaque and the transparent. What is illuminating is also mythologizing, what is transparent is also opaque, and what is opaque is also transparent. And it's not that it's opaque to the masses who see it, and then Kracauer comes along and makes it transparent. It's not like that. No, it's both opaque and transparent, both to the popular audience and to the critical theorist. Right, it's just that the critical theorist is sort of highlighting the convergence of opacity and transparency in a way that the masses might just be entertained and beguiled and kind of enjoy, but not sort of stop to kind of confront the contradiction. All that language, by the way, it's something that we'll come back to when we do the Arcades project with Benjamin. We'll come back to this. It's related to Das Kapital by Marx. It's commodity fetishism. He has this thing about the phantasmagoria of capitalism, where we kind of see through it, but also don't see through it at the same time, that there's a kind of optical illusion. But we'll come back to that. Yeah, cool. All right. Other comments or questions about the mass ornament? Sorry we spent a lot of time on that, but that was kind of crucial. It's kind of a key to the other readings. So photography. Now, I will say something just for you guys, like academic knowledge. So Kracauer was kind of rediscovered, and he was rediscovered and sort of used alongside Benjamin. And the way Benjamin and Kracauer were seen, since we're spending the next 2 weeks on Kracauer, Benjamin, and Adorno, Kracauer was seen as like affirming popular culture, and Benjamin also as like sort of giving credence to popular culture, whereas Adorno is seen as like rejecting or tearing down popular culture. It's not at all that simple. In fact, what that kind of parsing out of these thinkers, it's an undialectical reading. Meaning it's not a matter of either celebrating or condemning, it's a matter of critiquing. Right, so by contrast with the mass ornament, where he seems to, he literally wrote that the mass ornament is legitimate, that it's legitimate, like it's legit. By contrast, photography is a lot more negative, seemingly, rhetorically. And he's got the opening two paragraphs are about the two sides of photography. One side is how photography has the character of a perpetual present, and the other is that photography has the character of a historical artifact. And that photography, there's something about photography itself that presents time and history in a way that's different from painting. This is what the film diva looks like. She is 24 years old, featured on the cover of an illustrated magazine, standing in front of the Hotel Excelsior on the Lido. The date is September. If one were to look through a magnifying glass, one could make out the grain, the millions of little dots that constitute the diva, the waves, and the hotel. The picture, however, refers not to the dot matrix, but to the living diva on the Lido. The time, the present. The caption calls her demonic, or demonic diva. Still, she does not lack a certain allure. The bangs, the seductive position of the head, and the 12 eyelashes right and left, all these details, diligently recorded by the camera, are in their proper place, a flawless appearance. Everyone recognizes her with delight, since everyone has already seen the original on the screen. It is such a good likeness that she cannot be confused with anyone else, even if she is perhaps only 1/12 of a dozen Tiller girls. Dreamily, she stands in front of the Hotel Excelsior, which basks in her fame. A being of flesh and blood, our demonic diva, 24 years old, on the Lido. The date is September. Is this what grandmother looked like? The photograph, more than 60 years old, and already a photograph in the modern sense, depicts her as a young girl of 24. Since photographs are likenesses, this one must have been a likeness as well. It was carefully produced in the studio of a court photographer. But were it not for the oral tradition, the image alone would not have sufficed to reconstruct the grandmother. The grandchildren know that in her later years she lived in a narrow little room with a view onto the old part of town, and that to amuse the children, she would make toy soldiers dance on a glass plate. They also know a nasty story about her life and two confirmed utterances which change a bit from generation to generation. One has to believe the parents, who claim to have gotten it from grandmother herself, that this photograph depicts the very same grandmother about whom one has retained these few details that may also in time be forgotten. Yet eyewitness accounts are unreliable. It might turn out, after all, that the photograph depicts not the grandmother, but a friend who resembled her. None of her contemporaries are still alive, and the question of likeness, the image, or the primal image, the original image, has long since decayed. But the now darkened appearance has so little in common with the traits still remembered that the grandchildren submit in amazement to the imperative of encountering in the photograph their fragmentarily recorded ancestor. All right, so it's grandmother, but in reality it's any young girl in 1864. The girl smiles continuously, always the same smile. The smile is arrested, yet no longer refers to the life from which it has been taken. Likeness has ceased to be of any help. The smiles of plastic mannequins in beauty parlors are just as rigid and perpetual. The mannequin does not belong to our time. It could be standing with others of its kind in a museum, in a glass case labeled Traditional Costumes, 1864. There, the mannequins are displayed solely for the historical costumes, and the grandmother in the photograph, too, is an archaeological mannequin, which serves to illustrate the costumes of the period. So that's how women dressed back then: chignons, cinched waists, crinolines, and zouave jackets. The grandmother dissolves into fashionably old-fashioned details before the very eyes of the grandchildren. They are amused by the traditional costume, which, following the disappearance of its bearer, remains alone on the battlefield, an external decoration that has become autonomous. They are irreverent, and today young girls dress differently. They laugh, and at the same time they shudder. For through the ornamentation of the costume from which the grandmother has disappeared, they think they glimpse a moment of time past, a time that passes without return. Although time is not part of the photograph like the smile or the chignon, the photograph itself, so it seems to them, is a representation of time. Were it the photograph alone that endowed these details with duration, they would not at all outlast mere time. Rather, time would create images for itself out of them. Okay, so let's unpack that. There's something about time and photography. Now, he brings in a comparison to photography. He calls it historicism. So, photography, as we'll get to in Benjamin, was invented in the 1830s. That was also the time of the invention of modern historiography, or historicism. So what's modern historiography or historicism? It's a scientific approach to the writing of history. So history, people want verification of facts, empirical data. They want some reliable account of the past. A new sense of history, a new desire to have history recorded a certain way emerges at the same time that photography emerges. Now, of course, people had practiced history for thousands of years. They had practiced historiography for thousands of years. In the same way, they had practiced image making, depiction, painting, drawing for thousands of years. So what's the difference? And that's why he introduces the oral tradition here. So history used to be the oral tradition, and then when it enters into writing, it still has that kind of legendary character to it. It's still a kind of storytelling, which is different from history writing in the modern sense, or historicism. Similarly, there seems to be something scientific about photography that painting lacks. And yet, painting since the Renaissance has been conducted scientifically. Right, so there's something peculiar about photography. That's something that Benjamin's going to get into, about the invention of photography in the 1830s It could have been invented much earlier, but it wasn't. Meaning Renaissance painters used the camera obscura and used lenses as drafting tools. So why didn't they just record through drawing or painting the exact projection of the lens or of the camera obscura? Because it never occurred to anyone to do that, to just use it as the literal drafting mechanism to produce the image. They would have considered it inartistic to do so. Right? It wouldn't have created a compelling image. No one would have liked it. It also would not have seemed to have been a real likeness. Now the likeness question, this term that he uses, likeness, let me just take a little detour on that one. Because Hegel is invoked here in Kracauer and Benjamin. Hegel has a famous expression. He says, a painted portrait is a truer likeness of a person than the person is physically themselves. Painting is a truer likeness of a person than the person is physically present themselves. So what the hell does that mean? Right, so the idea is that the art of painting is producing a true picture of someone, capturing the essence of the person, capturing the essence of how they appear in a way that their mere physical presence would not provide. Right? Meaning the imagination of the artist is important in producing a true likeness. Now, why did Hegel say that? Well, because of course Hegel's whole philosophy is about mediation and about how truth is only achieved through mediation. So truth is not immediate in character, but only mediated in character. So the externalizations, the objectifications, the representations are actually necessary in order to present the truth. That reality itself isn't itself true. Only our externalizations, objectifications, depictions are true. I was just teaching last week in my other class this semester the philosophy of modernism, Hegel's introductory lectures on aesthetics. And he starts out saying, what makes art a worthy philosophical topic when art is about illusion and it's about deception? So famously, it's about the trompe-l'oeil, right? It's about the trick of the eye. It's about optical illusion. It's about the painter making the viewer see colors and lines and space that isn't actually physically there in the image. And then what he says is, Hegel says, well, in fact, it's a truer deception than everyday life is. So everyday life is also a deception, except people are not aware that it's a deception. It's an illusion of which people are unaware, and therefore it's a crueler deception, whereas the artificial image, the man-made image, the depiction of reality in art is truer because it makes us aware of the illusory character of reality. It makes us aware of our subjectivity in a way that our ordinary experience does not. So our ordinary experience robs us of the truth, whereas painting captures that truth because it objectifies the illusion. It objectifies the subjectivity that we ordinarily don't notice, but nonetheless inhabit. Right, so that's why a painted portrait of someone can be a truer likeness than they are merely physically themselves. Right, so subjectivity is essential. Imagination is essential to the truth. Right, because the truth is not just the facts. So there's something about photography and modern historiography, what he calls historicism, that actually has a deep ambivalence or contradiction about this. Which is to say, it seems like photography is a truer representation than painting because it's more empirically factual than a painting. Right? He says eyewitness accounts are unreliable. What does that mean? It means you can use photography as evidence in court. You can't use painting and drawing as evidence in court. Why? Photography is just as subjective as painting and drawing. But we trust the machine more than we trust the human eye. Even though the machine is a human-made thing. The camera is a human-made thing. right? So there is this paradox or contradiction involved in photography. Similarly, when we read history, when we read historiography, do we just want the facts? Do we just want the data? No, we want the interpretation. The facts don't speak for themselves. The facts are not in and of themselves true or false. It's rather the interpretation that would be true or false. And again, the values of that, truth and falsehood, would be subjective and would be variable. One of the things that is true about history is that we change our view of history. We're constantly revising what we think the truth of history is. We're constantly revising what we think the significant facts, the important facts, the consequential facts of history are. But we hide behind this objectivity in historicism and in photography. So in both cases, it speaks to the fact that we are actually uncertain or in crisis as to the truth. So photography and historicism as phenomena of the 19th century, and not coincidentally, phenomena of capitalism, because photography is secretion of the capitalist mode of production. That this uncertainty and this kind of spurious objectivity, again what Lukács called phantom-like objectivity, reified subjectivity, demonstrated in modern historiography and in photography, tells us that there's a crisis of our subjectivity, there's a crisis of our experience, in fact. It's a crisis of our experience of time and space. Now, not to jump ahead too much, but I want to, at this point, because Kracauer is setting it up for Benjamin, I want to turn to the Benjamin idea, which we'll return to in the work of art essay, the aura. It was an infamous term of Benjamin's, but usually completely misunderstood. So when we read the work of art essay, we'll also read Adorno's letter to Benjamin criticizing the work of art essay. And in that he says, you used the exact definition of aura that you had in the little history of photography, but somehow I preferred it there and then So what is the word for word? What is the definition of aura? He says it's the strange weave of time and space that is also the appearance of nearness or proximity and distance. So when we experience the aura of something, we experience it as the weave of time and space, but a strange weave of time and space, in which something appears both near and distant. Now, of course, what he's concerned with, why he even uses this term at all, is because he doesn't want to talk about aura, he wants to talk about the destruction of aura. Destruction of aura. So the destruction of aura is the destruction of this relation between time and space, and this relation between proximity and distance, or nearness and distance. Okay, so this helps us with respect to history of photography. They're parallel phenomena, but they're also complementary kind of opposite phenomena. So with history, we have a discontinuity and a continuity. So with history, we have continuity of time. So he describes it as a chain of events, right, without a gap. So we have a continuity of time, but we have a discontinuity of space. Meaning, to write history means that you can get this kind of chain of events, but dislocated from where it happened. So you pick up a history book, you're getting a sequence of events in time, but you're not in the place where it took place. Photography. Photography gives us a continuity of space and a discontinuity of time. So with a monoptical exposure of just a single lens, we get a homogeneous picture plane. And we have a similar phenomenon happening in painting in the 19th century, the homogeneous picture plane, which is different from traditional painting, which actually is a heterogeneous picture plane, meaning everything's not equally rendered. And the graphical composition of the painting, you're supposed to pay attention to some parts more than others. Whereas with the photographic exposure, especially monoptical photographic exposure, you get an even exposure, even treatment of the entire picture plane. So you get continuity of space, but discontinuity of time, meaning the snapshot. Right? When we think of photography, we're thinking of the snapshot. Yeah, when we read Benjamin on the Little History of Photography, of course we know that photography started out not as a snapshot, but as a daguerreotype, as a long duration exposure. Nonetheless, it still wanted to be a snapshot. Even though technically it couldn't be a snapshot, it still aspired to be a snapshot. In a way, the painting is not a snapshot. Okay, so how is painting not a snapshot? Because again, we're miseducated in terms of visual literacy. We look at paintings as if they're photographs. Paintings have different moments in time in the same picture. So of course, early photography, there was a lot of experimentation with daguerreotypes. There were multiple exposures. There was long duration exposure, but with motion, not where people were like propped up to like stay still for a long time. There was a lot of experimentation, but generally speaking, the currency of photography, the popular appeal of photography, was in the form of a snapshot. That also speaks, by the way, to, we didn't get into this with painting, but I want to make mention of it now, which is that the two genres of painting, something that we'll come back to with the postmodernists, but also along the way, history painting and easel painting. So last week we looked at the Diego Rivera, the Man at the Crossroads mural. That would be an example of history painting. So it's like an in situ architectural presented painting, public space, and it usually tells a story. So it's not something that you are meant to look at all at once, like just with a forward-facing vision. You're supposed to sort of walk past it into space and sort of take it in one piece at a time, and so that's why it's usually called history painting, in the sense that it tells a story. That as you walk past, you sort of get a presentation of a historical narrative. Easel painting, by contrast, is portable. And the dominant genres of the easel painting are the same as photography, namely portraiture, still life, and landscape. Right, those are the dominant genres of easel painting. What's interesting about modernity, especially in the capitalist era, not in the bourgeois era, not in the era from the Renaissance up to the late 1700s, but in the capitalist era, the 19th century, is that all painting becomes easel painting. Even muralistic painting, even history painting, even monumental painting, still is composed, it's drafted in such a way that follows the conventions of easel painting rather than the older history painting. In other words, it's still aimed at a kind of head-on view, individual viewer subjectivity, rather than the more collective viewing of circulating through public space of the history painting. because that affects the way the image is actually rendered, like the way it's meant to be experienced. So all painting becomes easel painting. And then even when you get, like in modernism, you get like huge scale, kind of monumental scale painting, it's still composed as if it were an easel painting, right? So there's like playing with scale, but it's still within the forms of easel painting. And that, again, photography, you could do all sorts of things with photography. We're going to read later about panoramas. There was also stereoscopy, if you guys know what a viewfinder is. Like the children, I don't know if they still use that, like a stereoscopic image, right? They could have done all sorts of things with photography, but it resolved on the monoptical snapshot and the genres of easel painting. That is the general appeal, popular currency of photography, despite avant-garde photography. One of the things that's motivating both Kracauer and Benjamin in the 20s writing about photography is that there's a rediscovery of early photography, and there's an opening of experimentation in photography that had lain dormant in the later 1800s and early 1900s. So in the 20s, there's kind of an explosion in avant-garde photography. Photography without lenses, stereoscopy, long duration stuff, all sorts of things. Collage, obviously, photo montage, that had not really been practiced since early photography. So that kind of thing had been practiced in the 1830s and 40s, but then it fell into abeyance and it came back in the 1920s. Right, so again, what that allows us to do is sort of see photography for what it is rather than the naturalized way that we usually experience it. And I should say that nowadays we don't do that. We're back to this ordinary snapshot photography. And there was a brief moment in the 50s and 60s, but much less so now. Right, so there's still this question of why there's this gravitational attraction to the monoptical snapshot, even though the medium could be used all sorts of ways. Mm-hmm.
Why did they think that?
It's an interesting question, right? And in a popular way too. So in the popular culture. So we know it from like surrealism, but it was popular, like Man Ray. It was popular at the time. It wasn't just something that was taken up, appropriated commercially later. It actually, did have a kind of an impact. And I guess we have the painting that sort of suggests this, which is the Duchamp, like descending the staircase painting, right? And also Cubism more generally suggests like things that you could do with photography. That's almost like painting is trying to do avant-garde photography. But again, that would be the question. The question would be, what's happening in the 20s such that this older, buried, obscure history would sort of reassert itself, and that people would start to be able to experience the strangeness of photography, rather than just the sort of taken for granted naturalization of photography. Right, so the idea is that maybe our ordinary life experience is suggesting that we're attending to its more crisis-ridden character in capitalism. And if you recall from Lukács, he had this language. He said there's a temporalization of space and spatialization of time. Right. So what that means is actually a crisis of the relation of space and time. As well as this crisis in the relation of proximity and distance. In other words, when we're dealing with images, what are we doing with them? We do two things with images. We use images to bring objects closer to us, but also to hold them at a kind of critical distance when we are able to consider them. So in comparison to ordinary life, when we have objectified images, we're using them to be closer to things than we ordinarily can be, and also to have a critical distance from them in a way that we ordinarily cannot. And again, this would just be, in Hegelian terms, this would be why humans ever made art. Like that's the way you would understand it. You'd say from the cave painting all the way to the present, what humans are doing is trying to kind of objectify and reflect on their experience of time and space, nearness and distance, like that's what all forms are about. So Kant had this idea that basic categories of subjectivity have to involve notions of time and space. However, across history and across cultures, notions of time and space have changed. So everyone has notions of time and space, but those notions are actually different across different cultures and across different times. So these are constant categories, and yet one of the things that makes them constant is that they change. Right? So the idea is that photography is an objectification or an externalization of a new experience of time and space, a new experience of proximity and distance. And that it happens in the era of industrial capitalism would be not accidental. And that it would recur as a popular phenomenon at different moments in the history of capitalism would also not be accidental. The fact that it would happen in the 1830s and 40s and again in the 1920s is not accidental. Meaning these would be sort of important kind of punctuations in the history of capitalism, or at least they thought. Right. Again, this is what we'll talk about in the second half of class, the crisis of experience. Where we read the experience essay and the mimetic faculty, right? The crisis of experience.
Struck a nerve with me when it comes to like social media and selfie now. Like the more I was reading it, the more I was just like, all of this is so applicable to kind of like the culture of ourselves right now.
Also kind of unfortunate though, right? So we have like a huge proliferation of photography, but also a striking lack of critical awareness of it. So we're kind of flooded with photography, but with no critical handle on it. Now here's another tricky thing. So we've completely naturalized photography such that it looks like, so I mentioned Hegel on the history of painting. It looks like all human image making ever was somehow headed towards photography. That photography is some kind of natural end of human image making. Kracauer and Benjamin, and we'll see Adorno, they're like, surely this can't be the case. Like, surely this is not the last word in human image making. Surely not, right? And also that there's a striking disparity between the kind of visual experimentation seen in painting versus the sort of static naturalism of photography, right? And so the question is, what would lie beyond this? That maybe it wouldn't just be non-representational painting versus like fully naturalistic representational photography, right? That there would be a kind of an image culture beyond photography, as well as beyond modernist painting. Right, so but yet that's where we've stayed stuck, right? So 100 years later, it's 2025, we're in the same place as in the 1920s, essentially. And in some ways, we've been there since the 1830s and 40s. Right? But is this the end of history? Is this the end of visual art? They didn't think so, right? In other words, they saw photography as a transitional phenomenon rather than as a kind of where we land permanently. And yet, we seem to have landed permanently. Right? In the same way that capitalism is meant to be a transition, and yet we seem to have landed there permanently. Right? So that's what they're doing here. That's what they're trying to do here. And they think that the fact that the form itself embodies a crisis, embodies a contradiction, shows its transitional character, shows that it can't possibly be a permanent end state. I don't know how we feel about that anymore, But you were saying that it hit home.
Yeah, well, just I think it was him. Talking about the Illustrator
Magazine.
magazines, and how it's like, you're showing all these people all these things from around the world, kind of like a dislocated fashion. And
Right.
And it's just, I guess, just drawing comparisons between that and a social media feed or something like that, where you're just flooded with information and photographs without any of the other information about it other than the image.
Right, it's a self-evident, like the image has a self-evident character. He calls it like the archiving or warehousing of nature. The photography is the warehousing of nature. And he also says, this is Kracauer, that also complementarily, the ideal knowledge of history that historicism seems to offer is according to the principle of photography, meaning, he says, if we had a continuous film loop that photographed everything from every possible angle at all times, then we'd think that we had like true knowledge of things. But he says, no, it would only give us the knowledge of things that photography gives us. Right. So again, why can't drawing and painting be used as evidence in court? Why can photography? Photography is no less subjective. Here's a little controversial before we take a break, a controversial anecdote. I always sort of hesitate before bringing up like hair trigger kind of political things. But, we're in Chicago. So up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in 2020, a few years ago during the BLM protests, someone from suburban Illinois, a kid from suburban Illinois, Kyle Rittenhouse, went up there because his family, I think his father, he was separated from his mother, lived up there, and his father's family lived up there. And he went out with a assault rifle to like defend property of like family friends, like used car lot or something. Ended up shooting some activists, some protesters, who nonetheless, they saw him with a gun. They saw he was a kid with a gun. They attacked him because they thought he might shoot people. He shot them in self-defense. The trial, I watched the trial. There was all sorts of video evidence. There was all sorts of photographic evidence. There were security cameras and whatnot. And of course, in court, they had to parse it. In other words, they had to alter the imagery in order to use it as evidence in trial. And so the lawyers had to explain, and they had to bring in technicians to explain in painstaking detail all the digital enhancements, algorithms, everything, right? In order to be able to basically get the judge and the jury to accept that this is meaningful evidence, right? That this actually shows something that can help determine a verdict. And I thought it was fascinating the way they got into, all the things about imagery that we take for granted, especially digital imagery, that are nonetheless highly constructed, artificial, right? They, talked about how when you blow up an image, how the computer fills in the image, and they had to sort of take it step by step in court, show, right? And so it's not that we're unaware of these things. It's just that we'd rather not think about it too much, right? We'd rather allow images to speak for themselves as if they're self-evident truths. Whereas in fact, they're just factual data, and then we actually have to decide what the meaning is, right? But we tend to fob it off and make truth objective, project it into the medium, rather than own it ourselves. And that in and of itself is significant. The fact that we yield to the technology the question of truth. Because we're afraid of subjective truth. So in a criminal court situation, you can't escape subjective truth because it's lawyers making arguments, it's the judge deciding whether things follow evidentiary procedure and law, and then the jury ultimately has to actually decide. And of course they exonerated him. They let him off, right? Despite, a very thorough presentation by the prosecution. Still, it was up to 12 random people to decide what the meaning of it all was. Right? And that's the bourgeois value. The bourgeois value is that you get a random selection of people to render a judgment. Because the facts don't render a judgment. On the other hand, we have all this technical criteria for evidence. And we know that a lot of so-called scientific evidence, even DNA evidence, there's all sorts of scientific evidence, fingerprints and hair and all this stuff, forensic evidence, that over time, it's actually that's not particularly scientific. It's actually quite dubious and bogus. But we want that, right? We want some kind of objective truth outside of us. We can't handle the fact that ultimately we have to decide subjectively. So, of course, the facts are he shot people. but that doesn't actually give you a judgment as to whether it was a crime, right? Was it self-defense or not? That's a subjective judgment call. That's not a factual matter at all. But the way they use photography, the way we discussed it, it struck me. Like I was like, oh wow, this is kind of an interesting, like the ambiguity of what does the photograph actually show versus what it doesn't show. What can it show versus what it can't show? It can't show intent. It can't show all sorts of things, no matter what. No matter how much you blow it up, no matter how much you do a slow motion or frame by frame, it will never tell you the essence of what's going on. We want it to, but it never will. And it's that contradiction. So we don't trust our own judgment. We want the machine to judge for us. And also the news coverage of it, like the way they were covering the trial, like the news commentators were like flummoxed by the fact that they went into that much detail. They thought, oh, well, this will only confuse the jury. And it actually didn't. It didn't, right? It was just we got this grainy footage from the middle of the night, so of course we had to enhance it and make of it what you will, right? But the newscasters speaking to the popular audience, they were like, we want it to clearly show one thing or another. So that's the issue. Why does photography have this strange mystical power? I should also say, of course, the obvious thing, which is the picture of Dorian Gray. The famous story about, which is not the photograph of Dorian Gray, it's the painted portrait, right, where the person doesn't age, but the portrait does. And again, that's written in the capitalist era. It's written in the late 1800s, and that is a kind of a parable, for this crisis of representation, crisis of objectification, of image making. Like how does an image exist in time, and how does it sort of relate to lived historical time? Right, so this is sort of the time of images, and then there's the time of actual life, and then there's historical time. Right, so the fact that those are we're not sort of settled in the relation of those things. So our objectifications of time and space are not something that we can actually feel settled about, but are deeply ambiguous and uncertain in a way that they weren't traditionally. In traditional culture, the objectifications were adequate to what people wanted them to mean in a way that ours are not. Ours are very fraught with ambiguities or ambivalences of meaning. All right, let's take a short break. All right. Hold on. So we're getting short on time. So let's do. Let's jump to experience and poverty and the mimetic faculty, and then we'll do the little history of photography. All right, so experience and poverty. This is a peculiar essay, but it's also very important. So this term experience, we had the other essay, experience. There are two words in German that are both translated as experience. So it's Erlebnis and Erfahrung. And so what they suggest is a kind of active experience versus a passive experience. So experience as something that one is oneself doing versus experience that's happening to you. Right, so that ambivalence around experience is important. The passive and passive and active aspects of experience, or the subjective and objective aspects of experience. So is one an objective experience, or is one the subjective experience? It says, our childhood anthologies used to contain the fable of the old man who on his deathbed fooled his sons into believing that there was treasure buried in the vineyard. They would only have to dig. They dug but found no treasure. When autumn came, however, the vineyard bore fruit like no other on the whole land. They then perceived that their father had passed on a valuable piece of experience. The blessing lies in hard work and not in gold. Okay, so that needs some decoding maybe. So with a vineyard, with grapevines, the roots run very deep. And so to turn over the soil, to refresh the soil, to keep the vines alive, you have to dig deep. So that's the reason why they have to dig deep. So the father lied to his sons to get them to do what they needed to do, but in pursuit of a false goal, right? So there was no treasure. Such lessons and experience were passed on to us either as threats or as kindly pieces of advice, all the while we were growing up, still wet behind the ears, and he wants to tell us what's what. You'll find out, or foreign, soon enough. You'll experience soon enough. Also, I'd say, so the noble lie, the idea of the noble lie, that's like a Plato idea, that societies have to tell their members noble lies to get them to do the right thing. Right, but the noble lie is actually truth. Right? So again, it's this kind of relationship between truth and essence and appearance that is being rehearsed here. Moreover, everyone knew precisely what experience was. Older people had always passed it on to younger ones. It was handed down in short form to sons and grandsons with the authority of age, in proverbs, with an often long-winded eloquence as tales, sometimes as stories from foreign lands at the fireside. Where has it all gone? Who still meets people who really know how to tell a story? Where do you still hear words from the dying that last and that pass from one generation to the next like a precious ring? Who can still call on a proverb when he needs one? And who will even attempt to deal with young people by giving them the benefit of their experience? Know this much is clear, experience has fallen in value. Amid a generation which from 1914 to 1918 had to experience some of the most monstrous events in the history of the world. Perhaps this is less remarkable than it appears. Wasn't it noticed at the time how many people returned from the front in silence? Not richer, but poorer, incommunicable experience? And what poured out from the flood of war books 10 years later was anything but the experience that passes from mouth to ear? No, there was nothing remarkable about that, for never has experience been contradicted more thoroughly. Strategic experience has been contravened by positional warfare. So Napoleon had crafted the modern, mobile cavalry, charge attack, and then that was put paid to by the trench warfare in World War I. Economic experience by the inflation, physical experience by hunger, moral experiences by the ruling powers. A generation that had gone to school in horse-drawn streetcars now stood in the open air amid a landscape in which nothing was the same except the clouds, and at its center, in a force field of destructive torrents and explosions, the tiny, fragile human body. With this tremendous development of technology, a completely new poverty has descended on mankind. So he's introducing here at the beginning of this paragraph and the beginning of the last paragraph the idea that poverty is not due to scarcity, but due to overabundance. This is the Marxist idea of capitalism. So a key idea that Marx had about capitalism is that it suffers from crises of overproduction. Not overproduction of articles of consumption, although it can look like that. It can look like a market is glutted with something. But more fundamentally, the overproduction in capitalism is an overproduction of capital itself. And that takes two forms. One form is money. So there's an overproduction of money, and that's why there are periodic crises of inflation in which money is devalued. There is also an overproduction of human beings. So the Industrial Revolution cuts human labor out of production and therefore produces what Marx called a permanent surplus army of reserve labor. So so a surplus population that then capitalism uses to restart itself, right? So basically there's a kind of a crisis, you have a depression, you have inflation, devaluation of money, you have mass unemployment, and then out of that combination of money that can't find profitable investment and workers that can't find jobs, capitalism reboots itself. Because eventually the money finds its way back to paying for workers to be employed again, but usually with different jobs than they had before. So every revolution in capital transforms the concrete forms of labor that people are doing, but then it ultimately leads to the same crisis down the road. So you have a crisis of manufacturing, then you have a crisis of the service sector economy, you have a crisis of the information economy, et cetera, et cetera. Like what people concretely are doing to make a living in their labor changes, and it changes through these periodical crises. And those crises are crises of overproduction. So unlike traditional civilization, unlike for thousands of years, human poverty was due to scarcity. It was due to not enough resources. In capitalism, at least according to Marx, the idea is that poverty is actually a product of overproduction, overabundance. So what he said is that experience has fallen in value because people were overwhelmed by too much experience in World War I. And here, similarly, we will see that culture has fallen in value due to an overproduction of culture. Right, so when you have too much of something, it falls in value. That's the basic thought figure that he has. So in this case, it's too much experience. He says the reverse side of this poverty is the oppressive wealth of ideas that has spread among people, or rather has swamped them entirely. Ideas that have come with the revival of astrology and the wisdom of yoga, Christian science and chiromancy, vegetarianism and gnosis, scholasticism and spiritualism. For this isn't a genuine revival, but a galvanization. So what does galvanization mean? It's like Frankenstein's monster. It's like you're shooting electricity into something to bring it back to life. We need to remind ourselves, actually skip this one, I'll skip down. What is the value of all of our culture if it is divorced from experience? Where it all leads, when that experience is simulated or obtained by underhanded means, is something that has become clear to us from the horrific mishmash of styles and ideologies produced during the last century, in the 1800s. Too clear for us not to think it a matter of honesty to declare our bankruptcy. So why do companies go bankrupt? Again, out of these crises of overproduction. Indeed, let's admit it, our poverty of experience is not merely poverty on the personal level, but poverty of human experience in general. Hence, a new kind of barbarism. So barbarism, this is a term we encountered last week with Rosa Luxemburg. We're also going to encounter it in a different language with Clement Greenberg, with Avant-Garde and Kitsch, where he calls it Alexandrianism. So barbarism here is being defined as too much culture. Actually, Kant, in his idea for universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view, wrote about how we've become over-civilized and we're living in glittering misery, or glittering poverty, would be another way of putting it, by being over-cultured, over-civilized. Right? So Kant said that already in the Enlightenment era of the 1700s. And that therefore the choice was to advance historically or to sink into a kind of barbarism. Barbarism, yes indeed. We say this in order to introduce a new positive concept of barbarism. What does that mean? Not positive in the sense of value, but in the sense of specifying what it is. For what does poverty of experience do for the barbarian? It forces him to start from scratch, to make a new start, to make a little go a long way, to begin with a little and build up further, looking neither left nor right. Among the great creative spirits, there have always been the inexorable ones who begin by clearing a tabula rasa. They need a drawing table. They were constructors. Such a constructor was Descartes, who required nothing more to launch his entire philosophy than the single certitude, I think, therefore I am. And he went on from there. Einstein, too, was such a constructor. He was not interested in anything in the whole wide world of physics except a minute discrepancy between Newton's equations and the observations of astronomy. And of course, out of that discrepancy, figuring that out is what allowed humans to split the atom. And the same insistence on starting from the very beginning also marks artists when they followed the example of mathematicians and built the world from stereometric forms like the cubists, or modeled themselves on engineers like Paul Klee. For just like any good car, whose every part, even the bodywork, obeys the needs above all of the engine, Klee's figures too seem to have been designed on the drawing board. And even in their general expression, they obey the laws of their interior. Their interior rather than their inwardness, and this is what makes them barbaric. So this basic image that he has here is that when we have too much culture, then we clear a tabula rasa and try to start again from the beginning. Here and there, the best minds have long since started to think in these terms, a total absence of illusion about the age, and at the same time an unlimited commitment to it. This is its hallmark. It's a very important statement. So not some kind of romantic nostalgia or kind of melancholia of like, oh, things suck now, they were so much better in the past. It's a total absence of illusion about the age, but an unlimited commitment to it nonetheless. It says it makes no difference whether the poet Bertolt Brecht declares that communism is the just distribution of poverty, not of wealth, or whether Adolf Loos, the forerunner of modern architecture, states, I write only for people who possess a modern sensibility. I do not write for people consumed by nostalgia for the Renaissance or the Rococo. So Adolf Loos is the one who wrote Ornament and Crime, basically paving the way for like the Bauhaus aesthetic and like new international style in architecture. So basically stripping everything of the ornamentation. So you just take the glass, concrete, and steel building and you rip the marble facade off of it. Right? So you have the same skyscrapers as built in the late 1800s, but instead unadorned. Right? So for Benjamin, that's barbaric, but in this positive sense. A complex artist like the painter Paul Klee and a programmatic one like Loos both reject the traditional, solemn, noble image of man, festooned with all the sacrificial offerings of the past. They turn instead to the naked man of the contemporary world who lies screaming like a newborn babe in the dirty diapers of the present. Let me jump ahead here. Well, he's got Scheerbardt. Let's see. Okay, we'll stick with this. No one has greeted this present with greater joy and hilarity than Paul Scheerbardt. There are novels by him that from a distance look like works by Jules Verne, but quite unlike Verne, who always has ordinary French or English gentlemen of leisure traveling around the cosmos in the most amazing vehicles, Scheerbardt is interested in inquiring how our telescopes, our airplanes, our rockets can transform human beings, as they have been up to now, into completely new, lovable, and interesting creatures. Moreover, these creatures talk in a completely new language, and what is crucial about this language is its arbitrary constructed nature in contrast to organic language. This is the distinctive feature of the language of Scheerbardt's human beings, or rather people. For human likeness, a principle of humanism, is something they reject. Even in their proper names, Pekka, Labu, Sifanti, and the like are the names of the characters in the book Lazabendio, titled after its hero. The Russians, too, like to give their children dehumanized names, so as in the Soviet Union. They call them October after the month of the Revolution, Piataletka after the 5-year plan, or Aviakim after an airline. No technical renovation of language, but its mobilization in the service of struggle or work, at any rate of changing reality instead of describing it. To return to Scheerbardt, he placed the greatest value on housing his people, and following this model, his fellow citizens, in buildings befitting their station, in adjustable, moving, glass-covered dwellings of the kind since built by Loos and Le Corbusier. It is no coincidence that glass is such a hard, smooth metal to which nothing can be fixed. A cold and sober material into the bargain, objects made of glass have no aura. Glass is, in general, the enemy of secrets. It is also the enemy of possession. The great writer André Gide once said, "Everything I wish to own becomes opaque to me." Do people like Scherbart dream of glass buildings because they are the spokesman of a new poverty? But a comparison will perhaps reveal more than theory. If you enter a bourgeois room of the 1880s, for all the coziness it radiates, the strongest impression you receive may well be you've got no business here. And in fact, you have no business in that room, for there is no spot on which the owner has not left his mark. The ornaments on the mantelpiece, the antimacassars on the armchairs, and the transparencies in the windows, the screen in front of the fire. A neat phrase by Brecht helps us out here. Erase the traces is the refrain in the first poem of his Reader for City Dwellers. Here in the bourgeois room, the opposite behavior became the norm. And conversely, the interieur forces the inhabitant to adopt the greatest possible number of habits that do more justice to the interior he is living in than to himself. This is understood by everyone who is familiar with the absurd attitude of the inhabitant of such plush apartments when something broke. Even their way of showing their annoyance, and this affect, which is gradually starting to die out, was one with which they could produce with great virtuosity, was above all the reaction of a person who felt that someone had obliterated the traces of his days on earth. This has now been achieved by Scherbart with his glass and by the Bauhaus with its steel. They have created rooms in which it is hard to leave traces. It follows from the foregoing, Scherbart declared a good 20 years ago, that we can surely talk about a culture of glass. The new glass milieu will transform humanity utterly, and now it remains only to be wished that the new glass culture will not encounter too many enemies. And of course, we live in that world now. We live in an erase the traces, steel, glass, Bauhaus aesthetic, culture of glass, culture of screens. Poverty of experience. This should not be understood to mean that people are yearning for new experience. No. They long to free themselves from experience. They long for a world in which they can make such pure and decided use of their poverty, their outer poverty, and ultimately also their inner poverty, that it will lead to something respectable. Not that they are ignorant or inexperienced. Often we could say the very opposite. They have devoured everything, both culture and people, and have had such a surplus, that it has exhausted them. No one feels more caught out than they by Scherbart's words, "You are all so tired just because you have failed to concentrate your thoughts on a simple but ambitious plan. Tiredness is followed by sleep, and then it is not uncommon for a dream to make up for the sadness and discouragement of the day. A dream that shows us in its realized form the simple but magnificent existence for which the energy is lacking in reality. The existence of Mickey Mouse is such a dream for contemporary man. His life is full of miracles, miracles that not only surpass the wonders of technology but make fun of them. For the most extraordinary thing about them is that they all appear, quite without any machinery, to have been improvised out of the body of Mickey Mouse, out of his supporters and persecutors, out of the most ordinary pieces of furniture, as well as from trees, clouds, and the sea. Nature and technology, primitiveness and comfort have completely merged. And to people who have grown weary of the endless complications of everyday living, and to whom the purpose of existence seems to have been reduced to the most distant vanishing point on an endless horizon, it must come as a tremendous relief to find a way of life in which everything is solved in the simplest and most comfortable way, in which a car is no heavier than a straw hat, and the fruit on the tree becomes round as quickly as a hot air balloon. And now we need to step back and keep our distance. We have become impoverished. We have given up one portion of the human heritage after another, and have often left it at the pawnbrokers for 1/100th of its true value, in exchange for the small change of the contemporary. The economic crisis is at the door, and behind it is the shadow of the approaching war. Holding on to things has become the monopoly of a few powerful people who, God knows, are no more human than the many. For the most part, they are more barbaric, but not in the good way. Everyone else has to adapt, beginning anew and with few resources. They rely on the men who have adopted the cause of the absolutely new and have founded it on insight and renunciation. In its buildings, pictures, and stories, mankind is preparing to outlive culture if need be. And the main thing is that it does so with a laugh. This laughter may occasionally sound barbaric. Well and good. Let us hope that from time to time the individual will give a little humanity to the masses, who will one day repay him with compound interest. So all this financial language at the end is actually quite important and even literal in character. Right, so the idea that history is being liquidated at a small fraction of its real value, and that hopefully one day all of this sacrifice will be redeemed. And to transcend culture as it has been practiced for thousands of years. Right, that's what capitalism amounts to. It amounts to a massive liquidation of everything that came before for a fraction of its value, and preparing humanity to outlive culture by any traditional definition. Right. So, of course, that's not like an image of socialism or communism. That's capitalism. Like, that is capitalism. So his kind of endorsement of that is ambivalent or ironical, paradoxical. It's not straightforward. This is where things are going. It recalls the language of the Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels say all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, etc. It's sort of neither good nor bad, it just is. But it has these symptomatic expressions associated with it. Okay, let's see what you guys had to say about experience and poverty. I know that you have some notes on that.
I focus mostly on like the interpretation as a reaction on as like critical of that, and I ended up quoting your line and then founded on these like on its pronunciation and its buildings, pictures, stories, and create out the culture of BP. I don't think I quite grasped it as what you were saying originally as like kind of capitalism forming these moments of crisis and reinvention. But yeah, it was more just talking about kind of the reaction to World War I. What that did to that generation that was involved with that.
Right, there's a kind of manic modernism after World War I in the 20s. Right, so he's writing this in the early 30s, but it's really giving voice to that same moment of the 20th century avant-garde, but also 20th century mass culture. That seems quite different from what came before World War I. The sort of Art Nouveau aesthetic.
It's interesting to hear that info use because I'm in that art program, so that was kind of brought up last year. The split between Art Nouveau and like craftsman aesthetic, and then the transition to kind of what like was more in the vein of loose, and how that was the onset to modernism. It's interesting to look at it kind of through this slightly different
Lens.
Capitalism.
Well,
Does make sense.
also that the Art Nouveau would be contemporaneous with like high modernism. Like the sort of Van Gogh, Matisse, Gauguin, like the kind of and early like Cubism, like the sort of late 1800s, early 1900s. That's a kind of high modernism, and then you get a kind of late modernism in the post-World War I era, and really a kind of fragmentation. So you get like the avant-garde, you get a kind of late modernism, and you get this mass culture. And I think that I mentioned also political art. Right, so political art that seems, again, sort of manically searching to justify itself on ideological or political grounds and trying to be relevant to the masses, whether through fascism or communism or just straight up liberal democratic capitalism like the WPA type art here. So, nonetheless, all of it seems different from what was right before, before World War I. And Benjamin, he was too young to really experience the pre-World War I world, so he I guess he's in his 20s when World War I happens. He's born in 1892. So Adorno, by contrast, who we'll read next week, is in his teenage years during World War I. So one thing also that he points out is that it's not that the masses are ignorant or inexperienced. They're not. That's going to be very important for Adorno's argument, that people's preferences as to music, it's not because they're uneducated or as to music, that in fact we're very sophisticated listeners. Like just the popular culture makes us very sophisticated listeners to music. And so it's not based on ignorance at all, but it's based on this other kind of dynamic, which is that we might want something simpler, right, as a counterpoint to the overwhelming character of everyday life in capitalism. Right, so again, popular culture is not based on uneducated or unsophisticated. It's actually extremely educated and sophisticated. All the pop artists and music producers and engineers are completely steeped in classical, So although it can appear that way, but that's because, like as Benjamin's putting it, there's this sense of being overwhelmed by this history of aesthetic forms and culture, and so there's just a desire to like bring it all down and simplify it, reduce it.
And it's interesting with blues and architecture, how like his form of ornamentation was like ontological to the material, and like thinking about that relative to what we're talking about.
There's a funny, this is another thing that Benjamin and Adorno, and also Kracauer kind of introduced it already in the Mass Ornament, which is this strange coincidence in capitalism of the technological and the primitive. So like the high-tech and the primitive seem to merge in capitalism. And primitivism, of course, is very much a hallmark of modernism from the beginning, from the 1830s and 40s all the way up through. Modern artists have always been fascinated by the primitive. And so the question is, what's motivating that? Why would that, in a way that would not have been the case previous to the capitalist era? At least not the primitive as such, right? So it's also the notion of the primitive that people have, which is this more ontological. And the primitive in this instance is also like the traditional in terms of like the merging of material and form. Right, the fact that form and material are like inseparable, that would be very much like an old style guildcraft kind of aesthetics. So, the blacksmiths, the carpenters, the stonemasons, like they all thought that they were initiated in the mystery of the material and almost the divine principles of the material. That's why like the stonemasons think that they're like keeping alive a craft that goes back to like the building of the pyramids. Right, so the symbol for the stonemasons is like Egyptian. Right, so and that's like a medieval, that's a very traditional idea. So it's interesting that in kind of late modernism, that you get a return of this, right? And it's a combination of like that kind of medieval guildcraft thing, but also if you know the Michelangelo phrase about the marble sculpture, he said that he didn't like create the form, but he just set it free from the marble. And of course that does have to do with the marble's own properties because it's irregular, right? So you can't sculpt anything out of any piece of marble, like the actual piece of marble does suggest what you should sculpt with it. But still the idea of like the identity of aesthetic form and material. Right, that's a very old-fashioned idea, and yet it comes back in the 20th century as like a super up-to-date, like technical functionalist aesthetic. It's supposed to be completely unsentimental, and yet it still kind of recalls a kind of more romantic attitude. And that's the kind of thing that Benjamin finds fascinating. Like Kracauer, he's trying to be true to modernism, and not in terms of romanticism, right? So the general like discursive conventions of literary and artistic criticism, especially in Germany, are romantic. And Benjamin, by contrast, this is something that we'll get to when we get to Benjamin on Baudelaire. He's very much trying to sort of import like French modernist discourse into German criticism as an antidote to Romanticism. Because he thinks that Romanticism is kind of obscuring of the issue. It's kind of obscuring of capitalism in a way that the French are more sort of straightforward about it. How are we doing? Little history of photography. Let's. I wanted to do the mimetic faculty. Let's do the mimetic faculty. We do have to do the mimetic faculty because it introduces a key idea for us, and that is, as we'll see, non-sensuous similarity. Non-sensuous similarity. So the main idea in this short piece is non-sensuous similarity, which we're going to have to unpack what that means. It is related to the idea of the artwork as construction, what he brought up in the experience and poverty piece. So we'll see that he's got two complementary ideas, Benjamin, the constellation and the construction. Okay, so nature produces similarities. One need only think of mimicry. The highest capacity for producing similarities, however, is man's. His gift for seeing similarity is nothing but a rudiment of the one's powerful compulsion to become similar and to behave mimetically. There is perhaps not a single one of his higher functions in which his mimetic faculty does not play a decisive role. This faculty has a history, however, in both the phylogenetic and the ontogenetic sense. So it has a history both in terms of origins and development. As regards the latter, play is to a great extent at school. Children's play is everywhere permeated by mimetic modes of behavior, and its realm is by no means limited to what one person can imitate in another person. The child plays at being not only a shopkeeper or teacher, but also a windmill and a train. Of what use to him is the schooling of his mimetic faculty. So notice what he does there. He moves to technology. So when a child imitates a windmill or a train, two things are happening. The windmill or the train are being anthropomorphized, but also the child is sort of becoming technologized. So of what use is this? The answer presupposes an understanding of the phylogenetic significance of the mimetic faculty. Here it is not enough to think of what we understand today by the concept of similarity. As is known, the sphere of life that formerly seemed to be governed by the law of similarity was comprehensive. It ruled both microcosm and macrocosm. But these natural correspondences are given their true importance only if we see that they, one and all, are stimulants and awakeners of the mimetic faculty which answers them in man. It must be borne in mind that neither mimetic powers nor mimetic objects remain the same in the course of thousands of years. Rather, we must suppose that the gift for producing similarities, for example in dances, whose oldest function this is, and therefore also the gift of recognizing them, have changed in the course of history. So in dances, like I'll use the example of the rain dance. So rain dance is on the one hand, a religious ritual act that worships the divine forces of nature that provide for the sustenance of the people. So it has a religious component, but it also has a magical component, meaning by doing the rain dance, you're trying to make it rain. You're trying to you're not only venerating and worshiping the divine powers of nature, but you're also trying to affect them and utilize them. Invoke them for our purposes. So he's going to bring up that distinction, an anthropological distinction between religion and magic. It's important. The direction of this change, in the course of thousands of years, seems to be determined by the increasing fragility of the mimetic faculty. For clearly the perceptual world of modern man contains only minimal residues of the magical correspondences and analogies that were familiar to ancient peoples. The question is whether we are concerned with the decay of this faculty or with its transformation. Of the direction in which the latter might lie, some indications may be derived, even if indirectly, from astrology. We must assume in principle that in the remote past, the processes considered imitable included those in the sky. In dance, on other cultic occasions, such imitation could be produced, such similarity dealt with. But if the mimetic genius was really a life-determining force for the ancients, it is not difficult to imagine that the newborn child was thought to be in full possession of this gift, and in particular to be perfectly adapted to the form of cosmic being. Allusion to the astrological sphere may supply a first reference point for an understanding of the concept of non-sensuous similarity. Okay, so let's unpack this. So astrology, so I'm a Virgo. That means that I was born under the sign Virgo. And what does that mean? It means that somehow I am like the constellation Virgo. So somehow the alignment, the constellation of heavenly bodies, of stars, moons, planets, are, given the different elements, they create a character structure. They create a kind of personality type that I imitate by being born under the sign Virgo. It doesn't mean that I look like the constellation Virgo, but it does mean that I am essentially like the constellation Virgo in terms of my personality, in terms of the different planets and stars and moons have different spiritual significance. So the combination of those is my character. So non-sensuous similarity. I'm like the constellation Virgo, but not sensuously. And you can't tell someone's astrological sign from their physical appearance, no. But you can from their personality type. Right, so kind of neurotic and whatnot. I'm definitely a Virgo, for sure. My mother was a Virgo too, and that might have more to do with it. I might have been forced to imitate my mother from Stockholm Syndrome. Because that's true of all of us with our parents. True, our existence no longer includes what once made it possible to speak of this kind of similarity, above all the ability to produce it, meaning this kind of thing used to be self-evident to ancient peoples. Now it's a totally obscure thing to us. Nevertheless, we too possess a canon according to which the meaning of non-sensuous similarity can at least be partly clarified. And this canon is language. Now, let me prepare you. Whatever you've learned about semiotics, about like sign, symbol, index, no, he doesn't agree with that at all. Completely rejects that. And we'll see why. From time immemorial, the mimetic faculty has been conceded some influence on language. Yet this was done without foundation, without consideration of a further meaning, still less a history of the mimetic faculty. But above all, such considerations remain closely tied to the commonplace sensuous realm of similarity. All the same, imitative behavior in language formation was acknowledged under the name of onomatopoeia. Now, if language, as is evident to the insightful, is not an agreed-upon system of signs, this is where he rejects semiotics, we will, in attempting to approach language, be constantly obliged to have recourse to the kind of thoughts that appear in their most primitive form as the onomatopoeic mode of explanation. The question is whether this can be developed and adapted to improved understanding. Every word in the whole of language, it has been asserted, is onomatopoetic. It is difficult to conceive in any detail the program that might be implied by this proposition. But the concept of non-sensuous similarity has some relevance. So the idea that words sound like their object. That's what onomatopoetics is. For if words meaning the same thing in different languages are arranged about that signified at their center, we have to inquire how they all, while often possessing not the slightest similarity to one another, are similar to the signified at their center. Yet this kind of similarity cannot be explained only by the relationships between words meaning the same thing in different languages, just as in general our reflections cannot be restricted to the spoken word. They are equally concerned with the written word, and here it is noteworthy that the latter, in some cases perhaps more vividly than the spoken word, illuminates, by the relation of its written form to the signified, the nature of non-sensuous similarity. In brief, it is non-sensuous similarity that establishes the ties not only between what is said and what is meant, but also between what is written and what is meant, and equally between the spoken and the written. So the idea is that spoken word imitates its object, but non-sensuously. The written word imitates the object, but non-sensuously, but also imitates the spoken word, but non-sensuously. And the spoken word imitates the written word, but non-sensuously. Right, so they're all imitating each other, but not in sensuous form, since after all, the visual, the auditory, and the physical object are completely different things. Graphology has taught us to recognize in handwriting images that the unconscious of the writer conceals in it. It may be supposed that the mimetic process, which expresses itself in this way in the activity of the writer, was in the very distant times in which script originated of utmost importance for writing. Script has thus become, like language, an archive of non-sensuous similarities, of non-sensuous correspondences. So what is this? So there's not an arbitrary relationship between signified and signifier. There's a historical relationship between the signified and the signifier. So that's why he rejects semiotics, because semiotics can never give you history. It can only give you sort of disjointed moments of the relation of the signified and the signifier. Whereas the canon of language, the archive of non-sensuous similarities, gives you a history of the mimetic character of forms. So language is the most thorough kind of archive of history of imitative forms. Mm-hmm.
What would you say about the Persian semiotic system?
That's what he's kind of rejecting.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what he's rejecting. So
I don't understand that system that well, but my understanding is that there's iconicity, which to me has a mimetic quality. So
right.
you could get an extreme from
You could. That's true. That's true. So it's not. Yes. Yeah. So he's not rejecting it wholesale, but he does think that there's still this kind of arbitrary character, meaning why are symbols in one culture different from another culture, and is it conventional? So it's when he says agreed upon system of signs, conventional. In other words, that it's merely the culture perpetuating itself rather than showing historical change through a culture. Right, so Benjamin, we haven't really talked about Benjamin. Benjamin, before he was a Marxist, he converted to Marxism from reading Lukács. He was a Nietzschean, and Nietzsche was a classical philologist. And classical philology is one of these romantic disciplines coming out of the 19th century, where it's very much concerned with like the history of language. So the nuances in changes in meaning of words and language systems, syntax, and grammar across time. It starts with biblical exegesis, scriptural exegesis, and moves into literary exegesis. So the idea is that by looking at the history of literature, you can see a kind of social history embedded in like subtle changes in language use over time and in literary form over time. All right, so again, it introduces a historical dimension that would otherwise be lacking. And again, non-sensuous similarity. So what is the non-sensuous, right? So it's not that it's imitated at the level of sensuous similarity. It's non-sensuous similarity. That means that it has more to do with what he calls the process, the mimetic process, so that what's being imitated is actually our kind of mental processing of the things. So it's our relation to things. It isn't just a sort of physical thing. It's we imitate it in terms of what it means to us. We don't imitate it just in terms of its physical form. We imitate it more in terms of its significance to us. And therefore, what you're getting objectified in language or in other kinds of forms is the objectification of this mimetic process. That's why he brings in the little psychological, analyzing writing will tell you how people feel about things, because their writing will change depending on what they're writing about, right? The unconscious. So that's what he means when he says the mimetic process. So you'll get that, and so the non-sensuous part of it means that you're not just imitating the thing, you're imitating your relations of the thing. And that's what changes historically, right? So our relation to things changes historically. Remember, he's a Marxist. He's writing about crazy astrology, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's Marxism, right? And that's because he's interested in the history of social relations and our practical relations to things. This aspect of language, as well as of script, does not develop in isolation from its other semiotic aspect. Because the semiotic, what the semioticians are interested in is the internal system of language. So he's saying, of course, there is an internal system of language, but it also has this, it's not just self-contained. It's not just arbitrary or conventional. Rather, the mimetic element in language can, like a flame, manifest itself only through a kind of bearer. This bearer is the semiotic element. So we do have this kind of systematicity in language and in other forms, but it's affected by this other thing, and that's the mimetic. It changes as a function of the mimetic. Thus, the nexus of meaning of words or sentences is the bearer through which, like a flash, similarity appears. For its production by man, like his perception by him, is in many cases, and particularly the most important, tied to its flashing up. It flits past. It is not improbable that the rapidity of writing and reading heightens the fusion of the semiotic and the mimetic in the sphere of language. So when you're reading, the idea is that as you're reading the words on the page, you're hearing the words on the page and you're seeing the objects that are referred to, and that all these things are fused. And that this is the mental process that is sort of embedded in language. So language isn't just sort of like a code, but it's a kind of objectified experience. To read what was never written. Such reading is the most ancient, reading prior to all languages, reading from entrails, the stars, or dances. Later, the mediating link of a new kind of reading, of runes and hieroglyphs, came into use. It seems fair to suppose that these were the stages by which the mimetic gift, so meaning humans started out reading the world as if it was written, even though it wasn't written, like they didn't even have writing. Right, so there was an experience of experiencing the world as written, even before humans had writing. And indeed, he's saying that that's where writing came from. It came from imitating how we perceive the world to have been written. It seems fair to suppose that these were the stages by which the mimetic gift, formerly the foundation of occult practices, gained admittance to writing and language. In this way, language may be seen as the highest level of mimetic behavior and the most complete archive of non-sensuous similarity, a medium into which the earlier powers of mimetic production and comprehension have passed without residue, to the point where they have liquidated those of magic. Now, liquidated doesn't mean eliminated. Liquidated means transforming one form into another. So preserving the value by translating from one form to another. And occult just means magical. So cult is religion, occult is magic. The difference between religion and magic, again, as I mentioned earlier, is that religion is about veneration and worship of the sacred, whereas magic is about manipulating the divine forces. And that's why magic always has the association with evil. Like, in other words, when you're manipulating the divine forces, are you profaning them in some way? Are you harming our relation to these forces in a way that religious veneration and observance of the sacred does not? And yet, you can't really divorce either science or art from the occult, from magic. Right, so art has a dual, and literature, therefore, has a dual heritage. It is descended from religion, but it's also descended from magic. It's descended from the occult. And that's why art always has this kind of ambiguous character. Is it reverential? Or is it manipulative and therefore potentially evil, blasphemous, etc.? So, yeah, in other words, when we're using language, are we just worshiping what exists, or are we also trying to affect it and change it? Right, so imitating is transformative. Like, imitating is not just repeating what exists. Imitating changes things. When we imitate things, we change ourselves, but we also change we change what he calls the mimetic object. So again, the child imitating the windmill or the train changes the child, it changes the train, it changes the windmill. It technologizes the child and it anthropomorphizes the technology. Right, so mimesis doesn't just leave things as they are, imitating changes things. Art doesn't just reproduce what is, it changes things.
Let's relate to his thoughts on photography as well. I think it's
Yeah, so we are out of time. We should return to the little history of photography at the beginning of next class. We talked about aura, but there are some other things that we would need to mention, like the optical unconscious. Meaning, again, we have this notion of photography that seems to be there from the beginning, and yet there is a history of photography, and there are significant changes, even if very nuanced changes, in the practices of photography. And especially that's evident, like I said, when he's writing in 1931, because it's in the moment of this 1920s avant-garde photography explosion that has taken place that seems to reveal aspects of photography that were implicit or latent, but not accentuated, not really fully cognizant in the culture. Mimesis changes things. Objectification, image making, representation, not just redundant, but adds to things. Like, this is actually an important point, meaning that art alters the world, art adds to the world. In other words, art is the imitation of life, art is the imitation of nature, but it also changes life, it changes nature. Art actually adds something. So it's not like it's the inferior product or imitation. It actually transforms what exists. It adds to what exists. Because otherwise, we do theory of representation is very bad, because it's a kind of very romantic idea, which is that somehow the representation is always less than the original. No, in important ways, it's more than the original. Again, the Hegelian idea that a painted portrait is a truer likeness of someone than they are physically. A portrait adds to the person. It's not just a lesser version of the person. It's greater than the mere physical existence of the person. Right, so art does something. That's really what the bottom line is. It doesn't just reproduce what is in a lesser way. All right. I don't have a second volunteer I have one volunteer for the music, but that we'll have to do. I'll send you guys via the announcements the links to the music for the readings for next week. And we'll come back around. Remind me, though, I might forget, to address what we didn't get to on the little history of photography at the beginning of class next time.